Welcome to the latest episode of the Informing Choices mini-pod. Politics can be defined as activities associated with decision-making in groups or other forms of power relations between individuals and groups, including the distribution of resources or status. Entrepreneurship is the creation or extraction of value, entailing change and risk encountered in starting up or conducting business. So how might entrepreneurial thinking play a role in the future of politics? How might political entrepreneurship support policy development, implementation of local initiatives, and support wider public engagement with political processes? To discuss the future of political entrepreneurship, marketing consultant, writer, and futurist with a keen interest in the future of politics, Michael Mascioni, joins me on the podcast now. Michael, welcome back to the Informing Choices mini-pod. Tell us a little bit about you and your work, and particularly your forthcoming book.
Right. Well, good to be with you, Steve. So I've had a particular interest in innovation in general, and most of the areas of innovation that I've covered has really been in sort of technological and business innovation. And, that led me to thinking more in terms of how innovation strategies and principles could be applied in politics, and beyond sort of the more common forms of innovation that people are familiar with in politics, social media, basically focusing on reinventing government through political entrepreneurship. And it basically utilizes some of the same principles of entrepreneurship in the business sector. So those principles including risk-taking, forming new alliances, mobilizing assets, and in particular, I profiled two politicians from different countries, from very different political perspectives, President Macron of France and Governor Doug Ducey of Arizona. And I felt that they were, emblematic, the approach that they were taking of political entrepreneurs, though political entrepreneurs do not necessarily have to be politicians. They can be media figures, they can be event organizers involved in politics and that sort of thing. But in any case, I thought those two politicians exemplified political entrepreneurship. Emmanuel Macron focused to a large extent on developing a broader and more solid infrastructure for technology development and technology entrepreneurship for startups, not only in France, but from all over the world. In the case of Doug Ducey, he also established lower regulations or less restrictive regulations and lower taxes to entice technology companies to come to Arizona and experiment with their new technologies and developing. And in particular, one of the industries that he attracted was the self-driving industry. So he was able to, again, entice them to experiment autonomous vehicles in Arizona. And even though they had some setbacks, it helped to, provide more stimulus for the industry and help them learn how to, market and develop their markets better. In terms of well-known or prominent in Europe include the NEOS, New Austrian Liberal Forum, the Alternative in Denmark, and the Five Star Movement in Italy.
Fascinating. You talk about political entrepreneurship, which sounds to me like political innovation or a part of political innovation. But what do you think are the critical trends driving this innovation, driving political entrepreneurship in both national and international politics?
Well, I think one of the key trends is simply that, traditional methods of operating governments have reached limits in terms of resources, in terms of, financial resources, human resources, and government has been perceived as not working as efficiently as people would like. Also having and open up new avenues for innovation and driving political entrepreneurship, economic development, developing new job opportunities, especially in new technology areas. And that's certainly true of both Emmanuel Macron and Doug Ducey. And, I think also that political entrepreneurs are better suited to forming not only new partnerships, but greater collaboration with the public. And I think that's another aspect of this that is driving, the trend in that direction.
So is part of this as well about reigniting public engagement, do you think?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a big part of it. And in the book, I think some of the principles, some of the strategies that I discussed that are also have been very effective when applied properly are, strategies like crowdsourcing and gamification that are used, again, in the business sector. And that's,
yeah. So, I mean, I imagine we're starting to see some examples of public policy design through use of entrepreneurial thinking. So, what are the prime examples that we see of experimental policy making as a result of entrepreneurship, do you think?
well, just in general, basically futures and foresight groups in governments at the national, local level are increasingly focused on project design and on experimental policy design rather than just gathering research and issuing reports.
Yeah.
So these are considered to be more practical approaches. So one of the best examples of that is the mayor's office of new urban mechanics in Boston, which is developing projects, experimental projects in various areas, for the city, in housing and mobility, transportation and leisure. And their approach is to develop this across agencies, so not just in a siloed way. And for example, in the housing area, they develop projects examining the possibility of developing affordable housing literally on top of existing city buildings or next to them, developing intergenerational housing for graduate students. So they're looking, at projects like that. Experimental Finland, which was, kind of a cross-agency mandate of the Finnish government, it's no longer in operation. They placed a lot of emphasis on experimenting, again, across agencies and developing sort of an experimental platform that can inspire experiments in different, in other agencies of the government and even outside the government in Finland. And it turned out to be, very effective. And they kind of leveraged best practices in terms of the experiments that worked out.
It sounds from what you're saying there that the collaboration both across different local and national government departments, but also probably collaboration between the public and the private sector is a critical part of that. Is that part, do you think, of increasingly open government as open government relates to innovation? Is that a critical enabler?
Yes, it is. And in fact, crowdsourcing is perhaps one of the best examples of open innovation in government. And I mean, there's been a big push, again, to enlarge the scope of input, to develop policies that are, more widely accepted and more effective. And that's the need, for input from wider sources. And again, that would be a characteristic of political entrepreneurship, to draw on input from varying players. One of the things I was going to mention, there was an interesting comment made by the Chief Innovation Officer of San Jose, and he believes that in the near future, there will be many projects that have been traditionally, conducted by the government, undertaken by the government, that will actually be, in a way, outsourced to nonprofit organizations, because he believes that they'll be more effective and agile in developing these projects in a more cost-effective way.
Is part of that perceived potential effectiveness almost taking the politics out of the decision-making process, do you think? I mean, one of the things I'm thinking of is, we often hear in the UK the role that politics play in the direction that policy relating to National Health Service is conducted. So taking party politics out of the decision-making process, is that one of the potential benefits of using NGOs to support policy development and implementation?
Yes, it is. I mean, I think, again, really the aim of, and by the way, there are experimental policy groups like Dark Matter Labs that are developing, these kinds of experimental public policy projects independently, but in conjunction with cities, with, governments at the local and national level.
Yeah.
So I see kind of, I don't know whether I would say that it will be just simply outsourcing projects to the private sector entirely, but there'll be greater collaboration.
Last question I've got is about emergent forms of government and what we might see and where we might see it in the future. And I guess to some extent, we've already started to see the birth of virtual nations. Futurists seem to have been talking about city-states for a number of years, and also the idea of how government might be formed in space, be that private sector occupancy on the moon, on Mars, or even in space stations. So what are the kind of emerging forms of government do you think that we might see in the future? Are any of those likely to come to pass?
Right. Well, all of them are at a pretty early stage, and many of them will take a while to, develop to any significant level. I mean, let's start with virtual nations. There've been a number of attempts at that. I mean, BitNation is one virtual nation that's driven by blockchain, and that's used to record legal records, identity records, and things of that sort. These are operating at a very small level, and they have very few citizens, if you can call it that. Virtual nations face a couple of obstacles, such as their lack of, sovereignty. I mean, they're not accepted by sovereign nations. And secondly, they lack land. They lack, physical space. And so that kind of limits some of their potential. But I do see that developing more significantly because you can basically establish these nations with much less difficulty in terms of cost, in terms of resources, and obviously with the rise of social media and the internet, it's not that.
Sorry to interrupt, Michael. Could the growth and increasing interest in the metaverse actually create space for something that we might become more recognizable as a virtual nation, do you think?
Yes, and the other reason that they're important is that they could be essentially labs for government projects, and that's why I say they could be satellites for larger physical nations.
Yeah,
and I see that kind of situation becoming more prominent, in the not too distant future.
Yeah.
Let's take space nations. That is really something that, again, is further out in the future. There are a lot of challenges. I mean, one of them is just a basic challenge in terms of living in space and dealing with the conditions in space, with sort of thinner atmospheres and, the necessity to have sufficient oxygen to survive. And one of the people that I spoke to, an astrobiologist, he pointed out that one of the issues with nations in space will be who has access and controls the oxygen supply. And that particular body, whether it's a government or whatever, will exercise more leverage over those that don't have that. So that's one thing. The other thing is basically how resources will be allocated just generally. And I think I mentioned to you before, one concept that has been proposed by Mark Fraser of this new Hanseatic League in space would be an alliance of different communities in space that would be working together, and they would lease land and exercise some influence apart from major nations. And then they would also test these kinds of nations would be testing basically projects, habitat projects on Earth, and using, in fact, virtual media and things of that sort, using the metaverse to simulate conditions on the space, habitats.
Absolutely fascinating. And what about city-states? What do we imagine the future for city-state might be? Obviously, a lot of people often point to Singapore, but equally in the UK, the role of London. London effectively voted to stay in the European Union, and the rest of England voted to leave the European Union, so the whole country leaves. So, do we see a potential movement in cities becoming state-like entities?
Yes, I think, again, that will take a longer time to develop for various reasons. But, the example that you mentioned about London is very true. One of the reasons why city-states may develop is simply because cities have, a certain amount of power and resources on their own. they have the capability to experiment more effectively than on a national or even regional level. And they have different interests a lot of times from the country in which they're situated. So they have, they would have an impetus to carve out their own territory. The other thing is that the success of special economic zones in certain areas around the world, like Shenzhen and China, kind of give some hope for, more impetus for city-states to be created and to thrive. So I definitely see that happening, although, again, it's going to be probably further out in the future, maybe 20 to 25 years from now.
Well, Michael, that was absolutely fascinating. We've gone from things that I think people could probably recognize in terms of local policy and local initiative development, particularly around social issues, all the way through to the potential for government and governance in space. So thank you so much for your time. Tell me, how can people get hold of you if they want to learn more about what you do?
Yes, they can contact me by email. My email address is mmascioni@aol.com.
Well, Michael, once again, thank you so much for your time. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Do let your friends and colleagues know about the Informing Choices mini-pod, and there'll be another episode along very soon.